Good evening. It's great to be with all of you. And before we get started, we just wanted to introduce ourselves, maybe more personally. My name is Zuhdi Jasser. This is Sam Westrop. I'm father of 3 children, and my wife Gada, who had a cameo in that video, is here and has been putting up with our work for decades as we put our families through all this. So my main job is as a physician in Phoenix, Arizona, and it's an honor to be with all of you.
My name is Sam Westrop. As Zuhdi mentioned, my name is Sam Westrop. I work for the Middle East Forum, and as mentioned in the introduction before, I occasionally do some work with the Hudson Institute and other think tanks. I focus on understanding the nuts and bolts of Islamism, of radical Islam, understanding its finances, its ideological trends and developments, understanding why small little bits of gossip and intelligence happening in an Islamist cell somewhere in the depths of Virginia or Iran matter to the question of Islamism more globally. There's so much to this subject, and we're very lucky, I think, to have 40 minutes to dive into quite a few key issues of the moment. But I'd like to start with quite a broad question that is nonetheless extremely important. We're led to wonder, after over 20 years after 9/11, did policymakers, did the press, did academics, did law enforcement ever truly understand Islamism? Today, more than 2 decades later, it feels that Zuhdi and I think, are still trying to inform these policymakers, these journalists, these members of the polity about the distinction between Islam and Islamism. Zuhdi, am I right?
Well, unfortunately, as our members of Congress are worried about whether they can wear pajamas in the Senate, where they haven't really, but in all seriousness, really there's 4 things to answer your question. One is why all of you should care about this, right? It's not an esoteric argument. It is relevant to people in Sun Valley and Idaho and across the United States. Second is, as a doctor, pretty much to me, you want to make a diagnosis, but if you just make diagnoses or just treat symptoms, you'll end up in malpractice court. You have to treat and treat disease. So third, what's the solution? What's the treatment? And where do we go from here, and why does it matter in 2023? I think the first answer to what you're saying about political Islam, I do think we've had some success. Back after 9/11, we were trying to explain to people that Al-Qaeda was just a terror organization. Groups like ultimately ISIS in 2012 and others were simply symptoms of a deeper condition. But ultimately, we found that the narrative, the language has changed. Islamism is being used repetitively now in national media, and I think it really is due to the work that organizations like ours and SAM's and Middle East Forum and so many in this coalition have been able to do. Because if you get the diagnosis wrong, your treatment will not only be wrong, but it can cause more problems. It's already hard enough the way it is. The relevance to all of you is that today you see many things coming after your rights, after your personal freedoms, whether it's collectivist movements from the far left and socialism and taking away, confiscating your property through taxation, through movements that have now abandoned law, like Black Lives Matter movement and others that are just about creating chaos and our open borders and other threats to society. We have in the coalition talked about the red-green axis, and many of us for a long time, my family came from Syria, in which there's been dictatorship there since the 50s. And I can tell you that these dictatorships solidify power through what's called a red-green axis. The Islamists, the theocrats in power, like you see in Iran where they're actually in power, but often secular dictators like Saddam Hussein, Gaddafi, and others will inspire power in their movements by working with the far left extremists in government or wherever. If you look at the UN, for example, the main anti-American, anti-Israel movement in the UN is a combination of the Venezuelans of the world working with China and with Iran and a lot of the Islamic majority countries. So this problem, we can turn and avert our gaze as much as we want, but the constituency for political Islam is 1/4 of the world's population. 1.8 billion people are Muslim. And it's a political movement about a faith that has not gone through the same process that Western faiths have gone through, in which we have a founding document for the greatest nation on the planet that pretty much tells us in the First Amendment that the establishment of religion through government is not a way through protecting individual rights. But yet religious freedom, which is part of that same First Amendment, is. So this is the part, if you get the diagnosis wrong, in that we want Muslims to embrace, I as a Muslim and my wife and I raise our kids to embrace their faith, their personal faith, but I never want any government telling me which Islam to practice, which interpretation of the Quran, what's the scripture, what Sharia should be, which Sharia laws I accept or not. And there is no Muslim majority country that has that right now. If we don't do this work in America, we won't get where we need to. And to answer your question, the FBI, the security forces, government, I've testified to Congress 7 or 8 times, and every time they pat me on the back and thank me that we really made a difference. And a week later, the ADD in Congress kicks in, and they go on to the next shiny ball. And I can tell you the decrease in terrorism, acts of terror, does not mean, if anything, it actually means that they've become more sophisticated in the way they're attacking us. They're using jihad. Jihad means a spiritual fight within the Islamic military to counter enemies. That can be civilizational jihad, it can be argumentative jihad, and it can be peaceful jihad, or it could be violent jihad. So all you might see on the television is terrorism, which is violent jihad. You have to counter all forms of it in order to defeat it, and you need Muslims to help you do that. So ultimately, our security forces are stuck in a whack-a-mole program, where they're going from one country to the next, one terror cell in America to the next, and our borders are letting in hundreds of thousands every week or two, millions a year. We don't know who's coming in, and to think that if you look at France, and Sam is much more of an expert on what's happening in Europe than I am, but at the end of the day, you'll see that they've still been dealing a lot with terror cells that are growing, but the influence of Islamic movements, just like the AOCs of the world in Congress work hand in hand with the Ilhan Omars, that is the red-green axis that is in Congress, it's in the UN, and it's at your doorstep here in Idaho.
So on the one hand, we have the jihadists, we have violent Islamism, and then we have this underpinning ideological question, I think often referred to as non-violent Islamism, or lawful Islamism is another term. So yeah, we have folks like Ilhan Omar in Congress, and we also have this enormous array of networks representing different Islamist movements from around the world. Law enforcement has been very effective in stopping the jihadists. It's been less effective at not only understanding lawful Islamism, non-violent Islamism, but today, just as 20 years ago, we see law enforcement working with these lawful Islamists, with these non-violent Islamists. A particularly good example is the Islamic Society of North America. This is a group founded by the Muslim Brotherhood in the 60s. The Muslim Brotherhood, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood at least, is a very important Islamist movement that has inspired not just other lawful Islamist groups around the world, but also jihadists as well. And in fact, I'm guessing most of the people in this room have heard the name. The Islamic Society of North America was founded by this group, and to this day it continues to advance the ideals of this movement. And yet even today the Pentagon relies on the Islamic Society of North America to appoint its chaplains to the US military. 20 years after 9/11, I'd suggest we should have learned not to rely on Islamists to tell us what sort of Muslim the US military should embrace. We've got more work to do here, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it amazes me that during the Cold War, we used to at least try to vet people coming in, whether they were members of the Communist Party, etc. And yet today, to even talk about Islamism is somehow looked upon as a race. It's looked upon as a form of bigotry, to question whether somebody has allegiance to a foreign theopolitical movement that is completely at odds with the American social contract and with our constitutional legal system. And yet, that is almost unspoken of in Congress. And I was appointed to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom by Senator McConnell. Over 100 mosques protested my appointment, said I was a self-hating Muslim, etc. And I remember telling Senator McConnell at the time, well, 2,900 of the mosques in the United States did not protest. So the bottom line is, and he said, that's all I need to know. And he ended up supporting my appointment. Now, that was in 2012. Now, I was replaced in 2016 because I termed out by Muhammad Majid, who is the head of the Islamic Society in North America. And in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, I talk about how my experience as a naval officer, I went to the Islamic Society meeting, and Siraj Wahaj, who is still one of the imams for ISNA, holds up a Quran and says, can you believe in this country we're told that we're supposed to believe some man-made document as the Constitution instead of this God-given document, which is the Quran, that should be our Constitution. I went to the mic, and my wife can attest to this, she was there, it's like, who the heck is this guy? I went to the mic and told them, this is sedition. I don't care what you guys believe, you're free to disagree with policy, but open advocacy against the Constitution is pure and simple sedition, and it's forbidden by our law. So this is the organization now that's advising, still advising, and rising up in Obama administration, Biden administration, to provide experts to help vet who should be formulating security policy with the NSA, with intelligence arms of our military, Pentagon. Most of the public diplomacy programs which were engaging actual liberals and classical liberals on the ground across the world have now been shut down in the Pentagon. So we are actually headed significantly in the wrong direction, not only because of this administration, but I think because of a lack of a focus on how to have foreign and domestic policy that represents in a forward way. One of the Clarity Coalition's mantra is that we want to take this on the offense. The other reason you should all care about this is every day we are on the defense. And as an American naval officer, I don't remember being trained to always be on defense. We're supposed to be on offense to keep our country safe. Now, I wanted to talk to you, Sam, about, one of the things the Islamists have adapted quite a bit to our enemies. And they're working with the Chinese Communist Party, they're working with Russia, domestic actors, neo-Marxists and BLM, Louis Farrakhan movements, etc. And now it seems like they're going across the aisle. They've embraced our allies in the conservative side, on the right side of the spectrum, and I think it would be very educational for you to talk a little bit about what you're seeing happening with the dynamics of their fluidity and intersectionality.
Right. Let me give you a quick history of Islamism and the Western political system, which I'll try to make extremely brief. Before the 2000s, and let's keep this to the United States for the moment, but before the 2000s, in the United States, most American Muslims were regarded as a suitable demographic for the Republican Party. They were conservative-minded, especially on questions of family, gay marriage, this sort of thing. And the Republican Party knew this, and it sought their vote, not unreasonably. And in fact, in the run-up to the 2000 election, George Bush had Muslims campaigning in mosques across the country for his ticket, and very successfully. Now, one of those campaigning was a man called Sami al-Arian, and he ran around Florida and indeed elsewhere, telling everyone about the importance of a Republican-led federal government and its usefulness to the Muslim interest. Well, Bush wins, as you know, although albeit somewhat contentiously. And then a few months later, Sami al-Arian is at the White House, meeting with Bush, meeting with other very senior figures in that White House. Just a few years later, Sami al-Arian is arrested. It turns out he has been funneling money to Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a designated terrorist organization. He's been doing this while coordinating and working with Hamas network, the Gazan terrorist group Hamas networks, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a variety of other Islamist movements based across the United States. Needless to say, the Republican Party, and especially the White House, had nothing more to do with Sami al-Arian, and a few years later he was deported. He ended up in Turkey, where still today he tries to manipulate American Islam and American Islam's relationship with government from his base in Turkey, supported by the Turkish regime. When the Republicans realized not only that Sami al-Arian was not someone they wanted to work with, but also in the wake of 9/11, that there were these enormous Islamist networks across the country, not just funding Salafi jihad such as Al-Qaeda, but also funding the Muslim Brotherhood and South Asian movements like Jamaat-e-Islami, and I can go into some of those if you want. They realized this and started prosecuting a lot of them. The government did a good job for a few years going after the financial sources of Islamist terror here in the United States. At the same time, the Islamists were thinking, we need new allies, we need new friends in Washington, D.C., and indeed across the country. And the left seemed like the obvious choice, especially in the run-up to the Iraq War. And you might remember some very famous scenes in 2003 when protests across Europe were taking place against the proposed invasion of Iraq. And you had Muslims, in fact Islamists, but at the time they were thought of as just Muslims, marching alongside far leftists, far left radicals. In Britain, this was led by a group called the Stop the War Coalition, which is very close to Iran, very close to Russia. And the Stop the War Coalition aligned itself with the Islamists, and the Islamists were happy to welcome them. And this took place in every European country, in the United States and in Canada as well. Islamists realized the far left could give them access to political power. Sure, it wouldn't get them access to the White House for the moment, but as soon as the left was in power, then boy, they had unfettered access. And they made a very good bet. And across the Western world, Islamism started to embrace some elements of far left politics and thinking. We saw Islamists suddenly talking about climate change along at the same time as they were talking about the desire to impose Sharia law. They were talking, hey, climate change is pretty important. They were talking increasingly about social questions. They couldn't quite bring themselves, of course, to support gay marriage because they'd have to admit they wanted to have the gays killed. But at the same time, they were trying to appear like they might be sympathetic to that. Now, as you can imagine, and as the point about gay marriage indicates, there were obviously going to generate some tensions with this problem. How can theocrats who support the complete destruction of the individual start supporting policies that represents perhaps the individual that is most flagrant, the individual at his most extreme, hyper-individualism, I think it's sometimes referred to, collectivism, you might want to call it. But either way, there was a clear clash between the extremist ideas of Islamism that opposed every social innovation the left wanted to introduce, and leftism itself, which wanted to impose things that would get you killed like that in Saudi Arabia and Iran and in various countries around the world that implement some level of Sharia law. This division has begun to cause huge problems. And for every Ilhan Omar who is embracing transgender rights while also working with Islamist groups, there is now an imam condemning Ilhan Omar while saying she no longer represents true Islam. How are we going to impose Sharia when we're dancing at transgender rights parades? This is a fascinating change, just an absolutely fascinating change. And so the problem is, now that the left is starting to realize that these Islamists may not be the peace and love Muslims they thought they were, well, the right is starting to spot an opportunity. And in some ways, who can blame a smart campaign manager for looking at a possible new demographic? But it is alarming, because my fear is that the right is about to make the same mistake the left did. They're about to assume that Islamists are their allies. And we're seeing this in Michigan. We're seeing Islamists send people to protest against books taught in schools, and they've got a point. They've got a point for the same reason many conservatives believe they have a point. These books are fairly horrible. I'm sure you've read about them in the news. They're teaching pretty abhorrent ideas. And yet it's Islamists who are pushing this, who are advancing this. And you had this very curious scene in Michigan a few months ago, or actually last year now, where you had Islamist-led protesters shouting "Down with Ilhan Omar." This sums up the divide and the change and this enormous political switch that has taken place. Where does this go? I fear it ends up with the GOP embracing Islamists a little more tightly. However, for the moment, there are plenty of Republicans who are pushing back against this, and this is comforting and good to know. The last point I'll make, though, is that there's also the question of government funding. And one thing that is constantly and persistently disappointing to me is that governments across the country, both Republican and Democratic Party run, give millions and millions of dollars to Islamist groups every year, at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level. Amazingly, the Trump administration gave more than the Obama administration. It's difficult to imagine there was someone in the Trump administration ideologically sympathetic to the Islamists, it does suggest, at the very least, a terrible oversight. And we're seeing this now continue, of course, under Biden. So across the country, what I fear is a growing uninterest in Islamism, to the point that they can look the other way as your taxpayer dollars goes to fund terror, goes to fund extremism.
And to punctuate Sam's point, however I want to say it, for the love of God, please do not think that our enemy's enemy is our friend. This is the problem, is that we think that somehow because there's these people demonstrating against Ilhan Omar, they must be our friend. No more than Bashar Assad, who fought against ISIS, is the friend of the United States, as he sent chemical weapons on our families. The bottom line is that you can't approach Islam and Muslims in an ahistorical way. The vast majority of Muslims, as much as they came here for economic freedom and understood entrepreneurship, etc., did not go through an enlightenment, did not study classical liberalism, did not understand the entire process that created the Western democracies, that was really born in that protection of the individual was more important than protection of the tribe. That concept of individual over community is something that we still have to go through in the Muslim community. And also you have to look at worldview. The worldview of Islamists that might be pro-life, that might be, I remember trying to fight the school choice movement in Arizona, which I could not support more. But yet there were some Islamic schools that were getting funds where, if you look in Minneapolis, a school called TIZA, the Tariq Ibn Ziyad Academy, was forcing kids into prayer, was pushing girls into the back of this classroom, was doing things completely un-American, very anti-Semitic. They tell their kids not to use the Pepsi machine because of Jews controlling Pepsi Cola and all this other nonsense conspiracy theories that were being indoctrinated in our schools in this country, and yet conservatives didn't want to say anything about it because the left might use it to unravel the school choice movement, because we also, and the ACLU actually, as much as I have my problems with the ACLU, were responsible for getting TIZA decertified in Minneapolis, etc. So we have to be careful to make sure when we look at groups that we ally with, they have a common worldview as us, being national identity oriented regarding America first, and second, being about constitutionalism, free speech, and other principles first, before they look at sort of the convenient idea of the day that endears them to the current political movement that they want to warm up to in a very superficial way rather than in a deep personal ideological way about religious freedom.
Yeah. I just did just a little bit of actual data for you to help illustrate this point further. I just scraped 12,000 electronically filed tax returns from the IRS just last week, in fact. And I was very interested in a very particular field on a 990 tax return for a 501c organization, where a 501c discloses how much money it gets from the government. Now, what qualifies as government differs from return to return. Some just report federal government monies, others report federal and state and city and so on. Others even report some foreign government monies as well. So take this figure I'm about to give you with a big pinch of salt, because it's very difficult to know where it starts and stops. And these are just Islamist organizations we have identified as belonging to a specific Islamist movement in the United States. They have reported over $650 million of government funding in just the last 10 years. That's almost $1 billion of taxpayers' money funding Islamist movements. And the horror that I suspect is that actually the true figure is a lot more, because that won't include the subsidies that don't get fully registered, money moving through a third party before they end up in the pockets of Islamists. And God knows a lot of federal money works that way. You move to a grantee first, and then the grantee gives it to a sub-grantee. So the true figure could be 4 or 5 times that amount, as far as we know. So these are huge amounts of money, and this is a huge amount of legitimacy that government is bestowing. And this takes me neatly, I think, onto our next topic, because government bestowing legitimacy on Islamist organizations is an extremely dangerous and recurring problem, because Islam is diverse, many movements, many sects, many competing ideas. Islamism is also diverse, many competing movements and sects. The one way that Islamists attain and secure and keep control over Muslims in the West is by getting government approval. The government turns around and says, we're going to give you $50 million. So Islamists then turn to the Muslims and say, look, we are the ones communicating with the government. We are the ones who are speaking on your behalf. There's a whole array of subjects we could go into about this question of legitimacy. One key one is the effect on ordinary Muslims and the sense or the loss of identity for ordinary Muslims who grow up being told by governments that these Islamists are your leaders. And so who are they to protest when they go to the local Islamist-run mosque and the Islamist imam tells them you're to believe in this particular aspect of Sharia? Who are they to protest when they again go to an Islamist school that receives federal money subsidies? Who are they then to protest when they join the Muslim Student Association at university or then go to work for an Islamist charity that also gets federal government monies? This is a problem. Zuhdi, unlike me, you work directly with Muslims across the United States. What effect has Islamism had on their feelings of loyalty to America, to the West, to democracy? What is the result of the Islamist stranglehold over Western Islam?
Yeah, I can't tell you how important this issue is. And to all of you, as we see people rushing across our border, I've talked to so many universities and Rotary clubs, Kiwani, all these different civic groups, and I tell them, don't worry about understanding Sharia and the Quran. Do you understand, when you talk to your kids, do your friends and neighbors understand what it means to be an American? Is there an identity where we are raising our children to be American first and everything else second? Not a hyphenated identity politic. It doesn't matter where we come from. My parents felt American the moment they stepped off the airplane because this country gave them freedoms to practice their faith that no other country would give them, especially Muslim majority countries. So as a result, the identity, and then if you look right now, the radicalization of our community, many of the Muslim kids don't want to be radicalized. They see the jihadist movements they see it as crazy, but yet they don't have an interpretation of the faith that's modernized that gives them any warmth, so they become sort of either a-religious, non-religious, or they start warming up to what's called jihadi cool. Jihadi cool is about podcasts and rap songs, and Andrew Tate is a perfect example. I can't see all of you, but I'd want to see how many of you ever heard of Andrew Tate. Probably very few of you. How many of you have ever heard of him?
Oh, at least a couple of dozen.
Okay, so Andrew Tate has easily 10 million followers on social media. He's an MMA fighter who now is actually in prison in Romania, is it? Or in Romania.
House arrest.
But the bottom line is that when he converted to Islam 2 or 3 years ago, his video was extraordinarily anti-Christian, and he didn't necessarily embrace Islam. He talked about why he hated Christianity, Judaism, etc., and Israel, other things, which shows you what our youth is being exposed to. And yet many of the Muslim kids were passing this around as some were critical, but most were actually passing it around as, oh, this is cool. This is what our kids are being exposed to, and yet we have no strategy.
If you don't mind me saying, I saw just a week ago a clip of a Dawa store. Dawa means call to Islam, so a proselytization store, in other words, in London. And these young kids, British kids, 11, 12 years old, all white, East London white, were taking the Shahada. They were converting to Islam. They were embracing Muhammad as their prophet. And the camera was watching them becoming a Muslim. But then they asked, why are you becoming a Muslim? Every single one of them said, Andrew Tate.
So our mantra to our Muslim Liberty Project is that we are Americans that happen to be Muslim, not Muslims that demand to be American. And that's it's not just a turn of phrase. It is what's happening with a lot of the Muslim kids that are told that you deserve rights, and all the issues related to critical race theory, etc., are teaching them somehow that, they should demand their rights as a Muslim, that if somebody looks at them differently, then it must be bigotry, and all this other victimization mindset, which is becoming an obsession, nullifying their identity. And the reason I joined the military is the only thing I would ever die for is this country. And yet if you look at Nidal Hassan, who also went to the Uniformed Services Medical School, committed a horrific act of terror, joined Al-Qaeda while being a psychiatrist in the U.S. Army, his CV looked frighteningly similar to mine. And I have a whole chapter about him in my book because you can tell early on that he was raised by Palestinian parents that said that this country was anti-Muslim, anti-American, that was part of every conspiracy theory, that You could think of regarding Israel and the deep anti-Semitism that's part of that movement. And he then joined the army and never separated himself from that ideology. So we have to, it's like fighting drug addiction. You can't just tell kids, oh, drugs are bad. You have to raise them in a way that gives them an alternative that they feel proud of, which is this country and our ideas. Because as Reagan said, we're only one generation from losing this country, and it's going to be from within, not from anything that comes from without. So the ideas that make us American are things that the Muslims that are basically only 4 or 5 million Muslims in America, I think have an ability across the world to fight political Islam by showing them that this country's social contract is the best one on the planet. And it inoculated me against ever wanting to die for jihad, because I would only die for this country. And my parents raised me to understand that, you know, Elijah Izbegovic, for example, the president of Yugoslavia, was in jail for 15 years, and he said he was never closer to God than when he was in solitary confinement. So I remember my grandfather telling me, you know, you don't need government to be close to God. You don't need freedom to be close to God. You will always have God. But you need a free government, a democracy, to be able to create and be human. And that's the identity we're trying to give Muslim kids. And it's extraordinarily difficult because there's not enough bandwidth, there's not enough resources, and these coalitions are just not given the same seat at the table that the Islamists are being given. And one last point I think is really important. People always ask me, we talk about Muslims, 1.9 billion or whatever it is, what percent are Islamists? The Arab awakening showed that 35% pretty much are part of an organized political party, the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islamiyya, large movements, the Khomeinists across Iran. They're not a majority. The problem is the other 70% are either communists, free marketers, whatever they might be, women's movements. They're so fractionated into 50, 70 parties, they're not united. And for all the problems we have in a two-party system, I can tell you that many of us, sons and daughters of immigrants, feel like it's a godsend, because when you have 20, 30 parties, you end up having the Taliban run Afghanistan, you end up having, the Shia radicals run the Iraq that we left behind. It's a disaster.
This might be a good moment, actually, just to demonstrate the sheer diversity of ideological choice that Muslims face, which is both good and bad. It's good because it means there are moderate alternatives to Islamism. It's bad because there are also a lot of Islamists seeking to entrap young minds as well. But I think this should also give you a sense of Islam and Islamism in America. Let's say I have decided to revert to Islam. Revert is what the Islamists say, by the way, because the idea is that we're all actually Muslim, and so you don't convert to Islam, you revert to Islam. You're going back to and so. So let's say I'm a convert, but I'm reverting to Islam. Well, what Islam do I join? What Islam do I embrace? Well, let's say the Islamists were the ones who reached out to me. That might be a Salafi, someone who draws their ideas perhaps from the Wahhabists of Saudi Arabia, but also other Salafi movements around the world, some kind of modernist and mixing hardline purist ideas with modern uses of technology and so on, some more conventional who reject all the excesses of modernism, even elections and democracy and well, obviously democracy, but even other things that some Islamists might tolerate. But maybe the Salafis aren't my cup of tea. So maybe I look to the more political movements that have already been mentioned. Well, there's the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood. They're a big one. They set up most of the Islamic institutions in America in the 60s. But, they're everywhere. Maybe I want something a little more niche. There's the South Asians. There's Jamaat Islami. Maybe something more clerical from South Asia, the Deobandis, the Al-Hadith, the Barelwis. The point I'm trying to make here is there's a lot of choice. And a lot of it is a very bad choice. Now, the reformists, what are they united by? Aside from an objection to Islamism, to hostility, it's difficult to unite theologically because Islam itself is so theologically diverse. There are different schools of theology, different schools of law, different Islams that embrace elements of Sufism, of spiritualism, different Islams from different parts of the world, hundreds of different Islams and it's difficult. While the Islamists can unite around a single political ideal, an extremist political ideal, reformism is trying to unite around the negation of a dogma, the negation of a hardline ideal, which is a lot harder to do. And so the reason that Zuhdi's work is so important, and indeed the work of all the Muslim reformists, trying to fight Islamism, is that they not only have to fight Islamists, they have to find a way to overcome the natural divisions and diversity of Islam and Islamism, which is particularly difficult. Going back to the question of identity, you can now see why this is such a convoluted topic.
And the most heretical thing, you know, which even my mom sometimes will get worried about, is I really believe we need a new Sharia school of thought. You know, all the different groups he talked about, there used to be 1,000 Sharia schools of thought from the 8th century to the 13th century, when Islam actually was vibrant and there was critical thinking and what we called ijtihad, which is the modernization of Islamic law in light of modern day. That all ended around the 11th to the 13th century, and it's been ossified since that time. But at the end of the day, there's basically 4 schools of thought in the Sunni tradition and 1 or 2 in the Shia tradition, no longer thousands. All of those, if there's one basic Islamic law text, and it's being published by petro-Islamic regimes like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and others that push this through the mosques all over the planet. You go into any mosque, even the few mosques here in Idaho, look on their shelves which legal text they have. It's not going to be any reform text, because most of it is on our computers and, you know, printed off paper and not going through any publishing houses. So this is the issue, is that not only do we need to have the ideas, we need to have the bandwidth to publish them in order to counter the ideas that are being published by these radical regimes. Lastly, I'm sure everybody, I think, is concerned, what's the future of Islamism? Sometimes, I mean, the only reason they haven't succeeded, I think, is because of their own failures and their own, you know, idiocy, if you will. Because every time we debate them, by the way, they lose the debates. If you look online, I've had many debates with imams, and they just never debate me again, because they realize the only thing they know about is scripture and nothing else about the realities of life. So what do you see as the future of Islamism and where American policy and life is going?
Let's very quickly talk about Europe to answer that question, just because we've long seen Europe as a harbinger for what happens in the United States. Europe's had an Islamist problem for longer, or rather, the Islamist problem has been more concentrated there, more patent. So perhaps we can look at Europe now and say, yikes, is this America in 10 years, 15, 20? Yes and no. Europe is in a lot of trouble. Demographically, it is moving towards a clear Muslim plurality and eventually majority in much of Western Europe. That's without doubt. That wouldn't be a problem were it not for the fact these communities are Islamist run. They are controlled by the radicals. That is a huge issue. Unlike the US, these communities in Europe, they're more, I spoke about at length about diversity, but these communities happen to be more homogenized. And a lot of that is a result of the immigration patterns of the 50s, 60s, and 70s into Europe. Britain brought a great number of laborers over from India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, where it once had the jewel of the British Empire. It's same with France. Its Muslims come from North Africa, or from French colonies, Algeria, Morocco, and so on. Germany has a very strong Turkish connection. Italy, indeed, also has a lot of North Africans and so on. Scandinavia has a lot of Somalis and so on. So there's this more concentrated, ethnically homogenous communities, and they're all controlled by the Islamists. And we're seeing, I think a popular term brought up often on Fox News is no-go zones mentioned across Europe. I've never quite bought into the terminology of a no-go zone, because I've been to no-go zones, which seems to negate the title of a no-go zone. What they are zones you don't want to go to. They are zones where there are attempts to impose Sharia standards, Sharia behavior. There are places where the government has ceded control over the running of certain aspects of society to the radicals, to the Islamists. These do exist. So while you can go there, I would advise you don't, which is a less snappy name for a zone. Europe is in a huge amount of trouble, and we're seeing this with the violence in Sweden, just the last week, if you've noticed this. We're seeing this with the violence in France. Whole areas of Britain are now unrecognizable. There's a town up in Yorkshire called Savile Town. It used to be a mining town, and 20 years ago it was a very white working class mining town. Today, and this will sound like an exaggerated figure, I promise you it's not, it's 99.5% Muslim. Moreover, it's Deobandi. This is this hardline South Asian movement I mentioned that spawned the Taliban. And this little community in this Britain is so hidden away from the world, so parochial, that the children grow up, and I heard this from a BBC journalist directly, having no idea they live in a non-Muslim country. They assume they are living in a Sharia state because they know nothing outside this world. And we're seeing little examples of this all across Europe. Europe is moving to a state I can't possibly imagine will end up tolerant or democratic. The United States is a very different prospect. Islam here is diverse. The Islamists have less power. They control a smaller proportion of the community. That said, they are exerting an enormous effect. Yes, they're not doing so well on the jihadist front, but they are in DC, they are in the legislature, they are joining the federal government, the state government, they are part of every aspect of the policy you can imagine. Islamists are getting involved. They wield revenues of about $1 billion a year in funding for their charities, their mosques, their community groups. They have more power than most faith groups for such a small number. We're not going to see what Europe has in America, but we are going to see a slow encroachment of Islamism, of political Islam, into the ordinary aspects of our lives, in terms of questions of halal in schools, or indeed what you can teach in schools, or what books are available in your libraries. Islamists are affecting all of this.
Maybe we can close 1 minute each.
Yeah.
If you want to.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's obviously more I'd like to say on that, but we've run out of time, and I think the point then I'll end with is this. There's been a fascinating shift in Islamism in the West over the last few years. We no longer, Muslims in the West, Islamists in the West no longer rely on the East for support. They are now powerful enough here in the United States and wealthy enough to export ideas abroad. And indeed, Islamists across the world now look to Islamists in America for guidance on ideology, on funding. So America is now an exporter of Islamism. This can be stopped. This can be stopped by cutting off their funding. Laws that stop the abuse of our financial system by Islamists, that stop government funding of Islamists, your funding, your taxpayers' money going to Islamists, all of this can decimate Islamist control over Muslim communities. We subsidize Islamism, we enable it, we empower it. It's actually an easy fix in some ways. And I can only hope the next generation of legislators pay attention to what Zuhdi is saying and end this funding of Islamism across America.
And I would also conclude that we can't continue to have such short-sighted approach to not only domestic communities but global communities. We need to have strategy that spans across our election cycles. Chaos, actually, just like the Islamists embrace chaos, we need to embrace chaos. The revolutions across the Middle East might have resulted in some things that are worse, but just like in medicine, when we treat cancer, sometimes the patients with cancer will get a lot sicker before they get better. Turkey's a great example. It's supposedly a democracy, supposedly part of NATO, and yet it is shipping across the planet more Islamist, anti-American, pro-jihad movements to Hamas and others than almost any other country in the planet. The largest mosque in the US now was built as an arm of the Turkish regime, Erdogan's regime. Second, nature abhors a vacuum. It's going to be filled by the CCP and others that are working with. Saudi Arabia just visited the CCP. They're looking at using their currency, not ours. So bottom line is we need to look at that when we look at global threats. And last, it's not just what we're against, it's really what we're for, and that's where you can all help us. You never know which Muslim you meet here in Idaho or elsewhere might be a future leader among Muslim communities globally that can affect these things, because we're talking not about a small constituency. It might only be 3 or 4 million people, but globally it's a quarter of the world's population. Thank you.